Today's talk, I think, is still called the baffling relationship between Russia and the United States. And in the last couple of minutes, I've been thinking about that word baffling. And for most of the relationship, which goes back to the time of the American Revolution, which, by the way, I hope we are all watching. There's a fabulous
Yeah.
series on right now. But at the time of the revolution, there was the beginning of a relationship with Russia. And that relationship was really quite good. It was essentially based on trade, uh, back of the idea that Russia was not going to interfere with the American Revolution, and it didn't. And that relationship continued right up until the first big bump in the road, and that was when the United States purchased Alaska in 1867. And the US obviously got the better of the deal. The Russians were upset about that, but things calmed down. The next big bump in the road was the Russian Revolution, 1917. But even there, the relationship did not turn completely sour. It was based again on trade. There was a lot of talk about the fear of communism, and it was real. But during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union once again became allies against a common enemy, Nazi Germany. And that is the key. Where the where the element that turns the relationship off or on a tricky path always has to do with Germany representing Western Europe. And that is where we are right now. And that is the war in Ukraine. Once again, what I would like to do here is sort of divide this talk into three parts. The first part is what was in President Trump's mind when he came into office, and there was the problem of the war in Ukraine. What is he going to do about it? What was the policy? Second half will be on Putin. What was in his mind when he started this war in 2022? And the third, I would like to really a concluding piece, which simply focuses on the possibility that there could still be a deal on Ukraine that is in the interest of both the United States and Russia. But let me start with Trump first. We all remember that when President Trump was running last year, he said that he had a plan that would take care of the war in Ukraine, that it was a simple matter, that he could take care of it within 24 hours. Well, there's been a lot of 24 hours since that time. What has been the problem here? And my mind went back to 1956 when I worked at the American Embassy in Moscow, and I worked under the American ambassador Charles Bolin. Bolin, as the representative of the United States, spoke Russian, was a student of Russian history, had been based in Russia several times before he returned there as ambassador. His whole life was wrapped up in the study of Russia and how that study could end up benefiting the United States of America. Since that time, ambassadors like Llewellyn Thompson came in, Foy Kohler came in. These were all people who understood Russia, spoke the language, and when there was a problem, and there are always problems when major problems are involved, what the United States could do about it. It is sad for me to report, but I think you all know this, that at this time, we have no high level representation in Russia. It is believed that the conversation essentially takes place when the President of the United States talks on the phone or on their one direct meeting face-to-face in Anchorage, Alaska in August between the two of the leaders. Where then is the relation taking place? Where is the manpower to support an important conversation between two great powers? I have never met Steve Witkoff. His background is that of a real estate magnate developer in the New York area, which is similar to where President Trump comes from. And obviously the two of them know each other. They've been involved in many deals, buying and selling property around New York City. And they both made a great deal of money on it, so they've been successful at that. But may I be courageous enough to point out that striking a real estate deal in Manhattan is not the same thing as trying to end a war in Ukraine. And the president had in mind from the beginning that it's a transactional arrangement. If I, as president of the United States, lean on Ukraine, in a sense, crush them into accepting a deal that I want and that Putin can live with, well, it's tough on the Ukrainians, and that's, as he said yesterday in another context, things happen. And it could happen that the United States and Russia reach an agreement on what's best for them, and they will then impose that upon Ukraine. When you think about that for a second, you say to yourself, if you're Ukrainian, you're not going to accept that. And President Zelensky so far has tried his very best to be as close to Trump as he possibly can, to make deals, to bend the rule in order to satisfy Trump. At the same time as maintaining the dignity and the independence of Ukraine. I believe that that is not a great deal that you ask of any leader in wartime. Defend the interests of your country against your enemy. The president has tried on any number of telephone calls now to sort of charm his way into getting Putin to accept his vision of a deal. That word is very important, of a deal in Ukraine. And in the president's mind, if you simply stop the war where it is right now, have a ceasefire on current lines, and both sides are then able, as a result of this deal, to satisfy their own interests and live side by side with each other. It hasn't worked. And it hasn't worked for a couple of reasons. And one of them I'll get into in just a moment when we talk about Putin. Today, I believe when I pass this on, I do so with a bit of cynicism, forgive me, but I have heard other deals that the president has been thinking about. The latest one is that Witkoff has been working, not with Putin directly, but one of Putin's people, Dmitriev, and for the last month or so. And they have worked out a deal similar in structure to what the president thought about in Gaza, where you have a 20-point deal, and they're now stuck on the implementation of point 2. Long way to go. On Ukraine, there is a plan that has 28 points, the first one being a ceasefire. You can imagine what the other 27 are like, embracing the interests of a global power, namely Russia. And here we get to Putin. Putin is not an ordinary Russian leader. He is a very cunning, shrewd ex-KGB, which is where he got his basic training, his vision of both Russia and its interests and its vision of the rest of the world, especially Western Europe, as noted by the United States of America, led by. I do not know what the other 27 points are. We'll all know about that soon enough. The important thing is, what would Putin accept and what is in his mind? In my opinion, and I stress that, in my opinion, Putin sees himself, remember, he's been in office now for 25 years. Very few czars were in office for 25 years, and only Stalin was in office for 28 years. So in Putin's mind, I've got another 3 in order to be the longest reigning sovereign in Russian history. Putin thinks in historical terms. He sees himself as part of a line of great Russian leaders. It is not an accident, as the Russians say, at the не случайно. It is not an accident that he keeps talking about his relationship to Peter the Great in the early part of the 18th century, then Catherine the Great in the latter part of the 18th century, then Alexander II in liberating the Russian serfs, and then Lenin and Stalin. Now, in recent years in Russia, Stalin has not been a figure glorified in any way. He's been seen, what Nikita Khrushchev said in 1956, February. He referred to Stalin as a murderer, as a person who did horrible things, damaging to Russia. And statues of Stalin, which were all over the country, were ripped down. Today, the statues are coming back because Putin, again, sees himself in an historical context. If in that context, you look out at your world, what is it that you see if you are a Russian? Ukraine is part of Russia, is what you see. Belarus, part of Russia. In Central Asia, where you have Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all of the stans, they are not part of Russia in the same way that Ukraine and Belarus are, because they are not Slavs. In Putin's mind, once again, he is the leader of the Slavic world. The Slavic world can deal with the stans in Central Asia. They can deal with China in the east. They can deal with Iran in the south. But those are countries you deal with for your own national advantage. But what is your vision of your nation? Your vision is unmistakably inclusive of Belarus, Ukraine, Russia. Now, because Russia extends from close to Poland, way, way over 8 and 9 time zones, till you get to Vladivostok on the Pacific. Those 3 countries, as one, represent the Slavic Russian Empire, of which Putin sees himself historically as a great figure, determined to recreate the greatness of Mother Russia. Ergo, what kind of deal is he going to accept for Ukraine? He's going to accept a deal that leaves Ukraine without an independent army, without the independence it thought it had since 1991, when it split off from the old Soviet Union, Putin does not want Ukraine to have an independent relationship with Western Europe, starting with Poland and going west. He thinks of it literally as his own, but he is no dummy and appreciates that things have happened since 1991. Bad things have happened in his view. So bad that he had in 2014, he had to retake Crimea. He then started the war in eastern Ukraine in a region, a strategic region called the Donbass. And in 2022, when it was clear to him that the leadership in Ukraine was shifting more and more toward the West, he had to stop it. He has no intention of giving up that ultimate goal. Which means if you want to bend as far as you can within this image of Russia's national interest, to strike a deal with President Trump, you can bend only to a certain degree. And you have to assert certain claims that are distinctly Russian, that you will find in Russian literature, in Russian history, in Russian music. In his mind, there is and he uses the expression all the time, there is a Russian civilization. It has a certain religious faith. You teach books in a certain way. There are new books now in Russian schools which did not exist until back in the Stalinist era when they did. That element is now being brought back into modern Russia. That you can think about Russia only legitimately in his mind again, if you think about it within the context of territory that is ours, that is Russia. Ask yourself, if you were a Ukrainian now, would you buy into that? In my judgment, no doubt there is a small minority of Ukrainians who probably figure they read Putin the right way, and in their minds they say to themselves, I guess the best thing to do right now is get a little bit of what you can get. And if you can get all of Ukraine except Crimea and the Donbass, but Kiev remains your capital, and we'll have a government, but a government dependent upon Moscow. And you're going to say, well, you're going to be a puppet. Well, we'll call ourselves something else, but we'll be dependent on Moscow. In other words, from Putin's point of view, you guys can play games down there in Kiev. You can set up a government, but that government has to be subordinate to Russia. You can have your own independent army. You can't have an economy linked to the West. If there is business with the West, it must go through Russia. If you think about an independent army, forget about it. That is, again, in my judgment, what it is that is in Putin's mind now and what he will settle for. Then let's try to link up with Trump here and see where it all gets us. Ask yourself the question, would Trump buy into that kind of deal? And here you have to make a judgment about the president himself. The kind of person he is, where he came from, the record so far of what we know from his first term and the last 10 months. Again, I keep stressing it, forgive me, but I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm giving simply my point of view. And that point of view says, based on history, based on my own observation, President Trump is prepared to accept a deal of that sort with Putin. But first, he understands that something has to happen with his relationship with Western Europe. Will Western Europe buy what would amount to a Russian victory? The West Europeans are not interested in accepting a deal because they don't think that Putin, that Russia is winning this war. There are a lot of people in Western Europe who have a point of view that I personally find very persuasive. They say that if you look at the economy of Russia right now, the economy of Russia is hurting. Russia has, if you went into a Russian bank and you were interested in getting a loan, you are going to pay 19 to 21% interest on that loan. Imagine what that means for your appetite to go to a Russian bank today and get money for investment in a business. It's going to be hard for you to do. The Russian inflation rate has gone from 7 to 10%. It bounces up and down, but that's high, very high. If you went into a Russian village, not in Moscow and not in St. Petersburg, the two big cities in Russia still live more or less comfortably. But increasingly, it is difficult for them for one very important reason. The Russian economy is based essentially on money got from oil and gas. Recently, the United States imposed sanctions on the two biggest Russian oil refinery companies. In addition, the United States has hinted about secondary sanctions. If I understand what they mean, it is, we in the United States do not want you, country X, to buy Russian oil. And if you do, we're going to put a high tariff on what you want to sell to us and other countries who want to deal with you. Now, up until this point, the Russians have been able to do reasonably well with all sanctions threatened and imposed. However, what I believe to be accurate is that as a result of Ukrainian bombing by drones of key Russian oil refineries, the amount of Russian oil available for shipment and use in Russia has dropped by 40%. 40% in the last year and a half. Think for a moment if there had been a 40% drop in oil production in the United States. It would be calamitous for the economy. Therefore, imagine an economy that is already weakening, now being hit over the head by oil deliveries cut back by 40%. I recently read a number of extraordinary articles written by Russian journalists in Russia, not associated with any Russian newspaper, television, radio operation. These are independent journalists, unafraid, writing about what life is like in a Russian village today, or even a normal Russian city that is not Moscow. And life there is increasingly difficult, particularly since, and this is a shocker, in the last year, in this year now, 2025, through October of this year, Russian losses in Ukraine have risen to 350,000 casualties, not deaths and wounded, but 350,000 Russian soldiers have been in battle and then out of battle because of injuries or death. You have to then find somewhere in the Russian society people who are going to then go and fight the war, because Putin will not give up. And throughout Russia today, here there's a bit of a guesswork, perhaps I want this to happen, but it may not be. But throughout Russia today, from what I read, from what I hear, there is a weakness, a sort of unwillingness to face reality, but obliged to. And many, many people still support Putin. I believe the numbers were at 68% recently, but bear in mind, a year and a half ago, Putin's popularity, quote unquote, was measured in the high 80s. It's now in the high 60s, dropped to 20%. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that Russia today is not Russia of even 2 years ago. And yet we think about, or some of us think about, Russia on the warpath can do anything. No. They are weak at home and getting weaker. And that means that Putin, because he will not give up, he sees himself as part of history, as he writes it. What can he do? And again, there's the great Russian expression at the New China. It is not an accident that right now Putin, every couple of weeks, talks about the use of nuclear weapons. This, me and I'm sure many other people, is an utter nightmare to contemplate. And I don't think he thinks he's going to use them, but he's using them to threaten Trump, believing that he knows Trump and can get away with it. If you shift very dramatically now from that, and I'll be finishing up soon for your questions, shift back to Trump for a moment. He's got his problems now with the Epstein file. His popularity keeps dropping, even among Republicans, hugely among independents. He is not a fool. He lives on those polls. He understands the meaning of those polls. And he wants more than anything to continue to think of himself as the middle of the world and the most important person in the world. And that what he determines is what really happens around him. I believe he thinks in these terms. And if as a result of the 28-point plan that he and Witkoff and Dmitriev, working on behalf of Putin, are trying to work out now, I wish them well. I think it would be marvelous if they could end the war. But if they can end the war only by capitulating to Putin's needs, my judgment is that the United States of America will then be humiliated. But that may, in fact, be where we end up at this point, given the personalities, the background, the history of the two most important people operating again above the heads and the interests of the Ukrainian people. Why don't I, at this point, back off and allow some of you to jump in and say, Marvin, you've gone out of your mind. Or that's very interesting. Maybe it isn't. But anyway, open it for your questions.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. The first is, do you think it would help to have an ambassador to Russia? Could that make a difference in any way? And I guess I'm wondering also about the role of Rubio in any of this.
Okay, well, let me try to deal with the ambassador issue. I don't mean to say that the ambassadors who have represented the United States in the last, say, 15, 20 years in Russia don't know what they're doing, don't have the proper background. Some of them are excellent people. It depends on the president you're working for. As an ambassador, you have the power only accurately to represent the president. Trump believes there is no real need for an ambassador. The only thing he feels that is necessary is Trump. And if he is there and Witkoff is there doing exactly what Trump wants, we will somehow work out this idea of a deal. So what used to be the case in our relationship, where ambassadors meant something, Bolin meant something, Thompson meant something, that position doesn't mean anything now, because the president believes that only he knows what is going on and only he can strike a deal with Putin that could possibly end the war. And by the way, also establish a framework for a solid, prosperous, ongoing relationship between the United States and Russia. These are two big countries that could be doing huge trade. When Putin speaks about that as a possibility and dangles that in front of Trump, I think that's true. And when Trump wants a big deal, he wants it. Yeah, that's what he lives for. But first, and this is something that Putin does very skillfully, he dangles before Trump the idea of a Trump Tower, another huge hotel right smack in the middle of Moscow, looking down on the Kremlin. And of course, this may happen, who knows? But this is something that Putin wisely, like a little toy, dangles before the president. And one of the reasons that the president would like to strike a deal with Putin is that the economic benefits of such a deal could be enormous to both the US and Russia. I don't want to knock that in any way, because there's a lot of trade possibilities there.
Thank you. And then some other questions have to do with the moral duty of the West in relation to Ukraine. Can Trump even comprehend what that duty is? And another question, will Ukraine surrender to Russia after all it has suffered? And what will the rest of Europe do?
No, I mean, but there are three questions.
Lots of questions.
Lots of questions, yeah. Think about the moral side of this first. I think we would all agree that morality is a very individual thing. We each have our own sense of morality, but it lives within a larger moral structure. People could argue that the United States, in the last 10 years or so, has lost its high moral ground, that we're scraping along the bottom, that we have lost our vision of why we are on this earth. And I have to go to these program that's on PBS on the American Revolution this week. The programs remind all of us, if you spend any time watching them, and we've already done that now 3 nights in a row, the United States of America didn't just happen. It was the result of a horrible war. But at the top of that horrible war were certain ideals, certain concepts, a certain morality. All men, interesting word, we'll get to that if you wish. All men are created equal. The man who wrote that, Jefferson, knew very well that not all men were equal. He had slaves. But there was an idea in his mind greater than the possession of slaves. There was an idea that man, the human being, was put on this planet to do great and wonderful things as free people living independent lives. And that sense of morality, in my judgment and in others as well, is now slipping and slipping badly. So think about yourself in a Ukrainian position. You are likely not going to win this war. You are doing everything you possibly can not to lose. You know very well, Zelensky knows very well, he has a terrible problem with personnel, with having enough people to fight this war. You know, there was a line the other day, again in the American Revolution, that when things got tough, people between the ages of 16 and 60 were hustled into service for your country. And it wasn't even a full country then. Ukraine is now living a day-to-day existence, but the president is unable by law to bring into the military, to enlist the services of people under the age of 25. Think about that for a second. If you're 26, you can be brought into military service. If you're 24 and a half, no, you can't. And so ask yourself, why not? Where are the young people in Ukraine? And what the young people are doing is trying to get out of Ukraine. They don't want to fight. That is a huge problem for the poor people in Ukraine. And Putin knows this because he has the exact same problem in Russia. But he has a country with 142 million people. And Zelensky has a country with 40 million people. Big deal. Big reservoir of humanity that you can pull into the service of a messy, ugly war. And it's different between Ukraine and Russia in that sense. The morality, again, is so difficult to define and to act on. Each country, each person is going to have to work it out for himself. But I believe that this country, this United States, still has in its soul a strong attachment to a high religious belief in the ability of man, woman, of course, to do and continue to do great things. I live with that dream. What are the other questions?
Pardon? You and I had talked a little bit about the significance of China in all of this. Do you want to touch on that a little bit? Our
Okay,
relationship with
yeah,
China versus Russia?
yeah. China is not a fundamental part of the problem between America and Russia and in the Ukraine war. However, they play an important part in two respects. Number one, they can send equipment, or not equipment, they can send consumer goods to Russia at a time when there is a shortage, and they can buy from Russia a great deal of oil, and they can buy models of advanced military equipment that the Chinese don't yet have. So both ways, both sides benefit from each other. But China is not essential to Russia continuing this war. A lot of people think that China is sending all kinds of military supplies into Russia, and without China, Russia would not be able to fight. I don't buy that. I think the Russians will continue to fight so long as the leadership at the Kremlin tells them that it's in Russia's interest and Russia must hold off the dreadful Teutons in the West, what they call the Nazis, who they say are in charge of Ukraine, and of course the United States. Again, with the United States, it is always very complicated because the history of the two countries leaves itself wide open to the possibility of a decent relationship based on trade for the most part and a willingness to look the other way when it comes to violations of rules that the Americans may say are unacceptable, or that Russia may find unacceptable. But we can live with each other, but we've got to get over this problem of Ukraine. And at the moment, in my judgment, it will not end well for Ukraine at all.
And what about the rest of Western Europe? What would their reaction be if Putin and Ukraine made a deal with Ukraine accepting some territorial losses?
Well, the Ukrainians will have to accept territorial losses if there is to be a ceasefire. The question with the ceasefire is, where are you going to draw the line? Trump believes you draw the line on the current border between the fighting forces of the two sides.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians will not accept that at the moment. They will not accept that. At the moment, Putin will not accept that. The only person who will accept that is Trump. And that is, of course, not good enough. So the West Europeans look with great skepticism now and cynicism on what it is that Trump is trying to do. I think they read him very well. I think they fear that Trump, thinking more about himself and America than any other person or part of the world, will, if need be, strike a deal with Putin and let Putin, if he wants to think of it as victory, fine with Trump. Trump does not regard Ukraine as in the direct national interest of the United States in the way that Biden did and other people did. Because in Trump's mind, when he looks at the entire world, what he looks at is the money, the oil, the wealth of the Middle East, and the economic potential of what is happening in China. Russia is a diminished economic power. So, yes, it would be great to put up a couple of hotels there, but he sees the future of his family fortune, of America's fortune, at the moment, wrapped up far more in the Middle East with the Arab side and Saudi Arabia leading the parade than with anything else. There's a question here from an old friend, and I'd like to read it and try to answer it. Trump has always boasted of his influence and friendship with Putin. Do you think he's ever recognized that Putin has played him time and again, for example, unleashing heavy bombardment of civilians right after they had talked? The answer is, in my opinion, yes. I think he believes that every now and then Putin is playing him for a sucker. And in Trump's mind, he also has a lot that he can do to hurt Putin if he wants to do it. He did a couple of weeks ago, as I said earlier, impose sanctions on two biggest Russian oil companies. And since that time, output has dropped, meaning income into Russia is dropping, meaning that the people in the street shopping, there's less to buy. Prices are going up, not down. So in Russia, and here I'm guessing, but it's based on a lot of reading and talking, the Russian people are not now where they were even 2 years ago. This war started, we sort of forget this, February 24th, 2022. We're ending 2025. It is possible that we're going to be starting the 5th year of this very long war. What has Putin got out of it? So far, very little. He's making a big deal out of holding on to Donbass, holding on to Crimea. But that may not be enough to explain to the Russian people why 350,000 of their people are gone in just 1 year. I think we're approaching a time when a big decision is going to have to be made either by Trump or by Putin. And of the two, I guess it'll be Trump who makes the call first. And the call is going to be, big guess, that he will go along with essentially what Putin.
In terms of territory, you mean?
In terms of territory, and yes. But more important than that, in terms of the continuing independence of Ukraine as a free country.
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine will not be a free country. Ukraine will not be independent. It will be part of the Russian Empire. However, the words, diplomats can use any number of words, but at the end of the day, what kind of power will a Ukrainian president have? Will a Ukrainian army be able to import weapons that it needs? Will Ukraine be able to strike economic deals on its own with the West? I think in all three of those fundamental areas, Ukraine will not be able to do that. According to a Putin end to the war continues because Trump has not bought into that. If he does, the war can end, but it'll end on terms that are, in my judgment, humiliating to the United States and horrible for the Ukrainians.
Thank you.
There's a question here that's kind of interesting about North Korea providing soldiers to Ukraine. How long will that go on?
Yeah.
It'll go on for as long as the war goes on. North Korea does not have does not have the kind of cachet, say, that China has, obvious. And North Korea, in order to buy and um, attract a better relationship with Russia, will keep sending Russia men. That's easy to do for North Korea. Nobody's going to object. It's a flat-out dictatorship. And so the North Koreans can send men as long as the war goes on. Nothing, excuse me, nothing can stop the North Koreans from doing it.
Sorry, people are still coming into this program.
Yeah, no, there are a couple of why can't the EU take a stronger role in support of Ukraine as a border nation with Russia? You already, that's it. Okay. No, why can't the EU? The EU takes as strong a position now as it possibly can, because it knows that it's already lost a good part of American support ever since Trump came into office this year. And the EU is doing the best that it can, but the EU, like it has for most of its life in the post-World War II period, they depended on Russian oil and Russian gas, and they're not getting that now. So they have problems. The economies in Western Europe not as strong as them. Germany is sort of the heart of the dream of a West European military operation, strength, importance. And they have trouble now in the same way that the Ukrainians have trouble. They can't get young people to buy into this idea. Young people in Germany do not want to fight. There's a small group ready to do that, but most Germans don't want it. So the European Union, the strongest backing in the European Union, Germany, France, England, Italy, those countries, to an extent, are hurting. Britain is certainly hurting. France is a political mess, and therefore an economic problem. Italy has never been that challenging, and it all rests really right now on Germany, whether Germany can somehow pull itself together. But when you pull yourself together in Germany, you are terrifying people in other parts of Europe who remember what happened not that long ago. So we're living in an extremely uncertain time. It all seems to hang on what will happen in Ukraine. And again, in my judgment, what will happen in the Ukraine very much has to do with the satisfaction of Putin's image of himself as one of the great leaders of Mother Russia. And that means he cannot see himself losing. He's got to somehow win. And for him to somehow win, Ukraine must lose. And Ukraine can lose when Trump says, when Trump just gets tired of the whole process. So to get to my sort of wrapping this up, to get to my point about the new American peace plan, the 28-point plan, we don't know what that is, but if the world latches on to the 28 point peace plan in Ukraine in the way that they did the 20-point plan in Gaza, if that be the case, Trump can claim he has ended the war in Ukraine, pick up his Nobel Prize, and march into history. Putin can continue to see himself as this great leader of Russia, Mother Russia, and march into history. And maybe the two of them will meet at a certain and have a trip.
In heaven, maybe, huh? Or hell. Well, Marvin, thank you so much. This has been just a fascinating uh, conversation and so relevant to major events in the world today. And to all of you who joined us today, thank you for being present for this conversation. And I invite you to explore other programming listed on our website for Chevy Chase at Home. I'm going to put that into the chat. Let me see if I can add. Okay.
You know,
I'll do.
I was just about to say that there are a couple of things here, like how old is Putin? He's 72. Is he healthy? That has always been a very, very big secret. He's had all kinds of surgeries that we are aware of. He appears to be healthy, but who knows?
And what about Trump?
Well, we don't, but that's interesting that you raised that. He recently had an MRI, but it's never been explained why. We don't know, actually. We don't know. We know as much about Trump as we do about Putin, even though both are constantly on television. I thank you all very much. You've been incredibly kind, and I'm grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marvin.